Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator for the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is part of the Democracy Observatory and is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Márcia Lima to our program. Márcia is a professor at the Department of Sociology at the University of São Paulo and a technical advisor to the Dean of Inclusion and Belonging at the university. She is the coordinator of Afro Research Center on Race, Gender, and Racial Justice at the Brazilian Center for Analysis and Planning, which is known as AFRO-CEBRAP. She has a PhD in sociology from the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro and has a postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Columbia and was a visiting fellow at the Afro-Latin American Research Institute at Harvard University. She's a member of the Brazilian Society of Sociology, the Latin American Studies Association, and the Brazilian Studies Association. She has researched and published in the areas of racial inequality, gender and race, and affirmative action. Márcia, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Great. Márcia, could you tell us a little bit about your research? What are you working on currently?
I have investigated race and gender inequalities, especially in the labor market and education, throughout my career. But recently, in the last 15 years, maybe, I've focused my research agenda on affirmative action policies in Brazil, especially the public policies to access the higher education. I've already studied the ProUni, the University for All. It's a very important program to private higher education system. And currently, I'm working with Luiz Augusto Campos from UERJ, Rio de Janeiro, in a huge research about the 2 decades of affirmative action policy. And we have a consortium with 7 Brazilian universities. And we're trying to figure out the achievements and also the challenges for this policy for the future. Is thinking more about the future than the past. So when we want to evaluate what's happened until now, but our goals are to figure out how you can improve the affirmative action.
Could you maybe
policies.
tell our listeners a little about the history of how affirmative action was actually implemented in Brazil?
Yeah, that's a very curious because everybody talks about the law, the quotas law that people says, but the quotas law in this year, 2022, completes 10 years of the law, but the affirmative action policy in Brazil completes in the same year 20 years. So we have 2 moments for this, to understand the affirmative action in Brazil. The first decade, we don't have a federal law, to implement the policy in all federal universities, for example, like we have now. But when the law was created in 2012, 86% of the public universities in Brazil already implemented affirmative action. So the law is important to understand what's happening now, and the law create the same way for every Brazilian university, federal university, to implement this policy. But we have different experience from different universities before the law. And this previous experience was very, very important to create the law. So the law is a result of 10 years of experience trying to apply for the inclusion, social inclusion, the racial inclusion in different Brazilian universities.
So for our listener who might not know about the Brazilian educational system, the best universities in Brazil are, with 1 or 2 exceptions, are the federally funded government organizations. There's 1 or 2 state universities, which are particularly good as well in the state of São Paulo. And tuition is free for undergraduate and graduate programs. And so in the past, historically, middle class and upper class kids would go to private schools for high school to prepare to pass the entrance exam to get into the free universities. Whereas people from low income, especially people of Afro descent or people of indigenous origins, really went to public schools, which weren't as good, and therefore it was harder for them to get into the university. So the system that was established 20 years ago tried to break down that kind of implicit structural racial barrier between white, upper class, privileged people in general, though there were exceptions, and the large number of people who are of African and indigenous descent. So that kind of started in the government of Fernando Henrique Cardoso in the Ministry of Foreign Relations when he implemented an affirmative action program to get into the school to prepare for the career in diplomacy. But it really got underway during the governments of the Workers' Party after Lula. Is there a relationship between the Workers' Party coming to power and the expansion of the affirmative action programs? And if there is, so could you talk about that?
Yes, I believe there is a connection, especially because the affirmative action policies are, I think, the most important demand from Black movement Brazil, and this demand started up decades ago. And so I have a concern to say that because affirmative action, the quotas policies, they're not a Lula's idea or a PT idea, but the PT's government was very important to implement this policy, considering the participation of the Black movement inside the parties and inside the government. So it's very crucial to understand this process. And another thing that I think is important to emphasize is the higher education system in Brazil is mostly private. So when we talk about the 85% of the enrollments in higher education system in Brazil are in the private system. So that you talk when you said about the Brazilian system and the breakdown about the affirmative action. In my opinion, the most important breakdown is in the public system, because they smaller than the private system, and the public system is much better in terms of the qualification and in terms of research and another. That's the triad about research, teaching, and extension. For example, the idea of university. And they have the better formation than private universities. So I think that's one of the reasons the debate about affirmative action policies to the public universities was so hard and so tensions in Brazil, because it's a very, very important part of the Brazilian elite space. It's a completely wide space and rich space, and these policies have changed completely the profile of the university students in Brazil. So the tension about this very special portion of access to higher education in Brazil. Nobody cares about affirmative action in the private system. The problem with affirmative action in the public system, because this system represents the Brazilian elite.
Right. And I studied at the University of São Paulo in the late 70s in the social sciences, where you teach now in sociology, and it was very, very white. It was very much middle class. There were a few people from poor backgrounds, working class backgrounds, but it was mostly middle and upper class kids who had gone to private high schools to pass the exams to get into the university. So the law schools, the medical schools, the good schools, the engineering schools traditionally have been part of the white elite and their children, and the idea of reproducing class relations and racial relations in that way. So how does a quota system work exactly? So that, again, for our listeners who might not know that, what does the federal law provide in terms of the enrollments of students in the public schools, public universities?
The federal law reserves 50% of all the enrollment to students from a public system in Brazil. A student who attends the high school in the public system, because the high school public system in Brazil, it's for the poor people, the Black people, and the private high school system for the rich people, as you said before. And within this 50% of seats for public high school students, we have a proportion for white poor people and a proportion for Black poor people. So we don't have racial quotas in Brazil. The racial quotas actually is a sub-quota. It's a part of the quota is for Black people and indigenous people, and this proportion is the proportion of the Black and indigenous people in each state in Brazil. For example, in São Paulo, 35% of the population is Black and indigenous. So within this 50%, we reserve 35% for the Black people, and that's the way the law works. So there is no racial quotas only, but the idea is to guarantee a representation of the Black and the Black poor people and the white poor people inside this reservation. So
that would mean, in fact, that a person who is of European background but from a poor family could also be a part of this 50% if they had gone to a public school. So it's very different from other constructions of the notion of affirmative action in other countries in that regard. So the other thing that is notable since the beginning of the 21st century, and it overlaps with the Workers' Party, although in the government, although I don't think, like affirmative action, there's not necessarily a direct causation, there's sort of an overlap, is change in racial identity. Whereas when I lived in Brazil in the 70s and I knew people in the Black United Movement, Movimento Negro Unificado, it was a movement that was going against the current in the sense that most people didn't embrace a notion if one has some African heritage, then one can identify as Black, even though their skin color might be light. And that has changed dramatically in the last 20 years. Could you talk about that?
Yeah. First, I'd like to state that racial classification does not work as synonymous of the racial identity. I think there is different thing when we talk about racial composition and racial identity in Brazil. Racial classification or racial composition is based on official data about IBGE from Brazilian statistics, official office in Brazil, and national statistics. And and these categories are color, like Black, brown, white, yellow, and indigenous. And racial identity is about other things. It's about how can I identify myself with the Black population situation, and if I face or not racism in my everyday life, and if I wanted to construct my racial identity as a political thing. But it's curious because both the racial classification, the racial composition have changed in Brazil. For example, between 2000 and 2010, according to official statistics, Brazil officially became a Black country in the first decade of this century. In 2000, we have 45% of Brazilians declare themselves as a Black and indigenous. In 2010, and this proportion increased to 51.3%. So it's official. In 21st century, Brazil became a Black country.
And this is using the classification of negro y pardo, that is of Black and people who, pardo is a hard term to translate. I always find difficulty, but how do you translate pardo when you do it?
It's brown. I explain the idea of color to demographic way to classify people by color. And it's okay, use Black, brown, and indigenous. And the problem is we can use Negro in English. No? It's very complicated to translate Negro to Negro. So you translate Black and brown as a Black. So when you put together Black and brown and you call Black, it doesn't make sense maybe, but that's the only way you have to use these categories when you're trying to translate, because it's impossible to use the word Negro in English. So we put together Black and brown in Brazil, we have 51.3% of our Brazilian population classified themselves as Black or pardo. Yeah. But when discussing racial identity, I think we are mobilizing and building a political and a historical identity.
So that means that a person might be very light-skinned and 30 years ago might have not said I'm Black, but today would understand about their racial heritage, their history in their ancestors of slavery and discrimination and structural racism, and therefore identify culturally, politically as Black today, whereas maybe 20 or 30 years ago, their mother or their father might not have had that identification.
I think the most changing about the racial identity in Brazil is nowadays people has proud to be Black, has proud to looking for your roots, find your roots like Skip Gates, and people have more proud to be Black in Brazil. I think that's an amazing transformation. And this amazing transformation, for me, in my opinion, my interpretation, is very connected with the Black youth population and is connected to the change to access to higher education. And a lot of changes you have recently in Brazil, in the world, the social media, we're going to talk about later. But for me, I'm 51 years old. And when I was a kid, to be Black was so embarrassing to talk about race in the schools, to talk about race in my family. And the idea to be discriminated by races, I can't talk about it. We feel that we have this feeling. We had this feeling when I was a child. My generation had the feeling about racism, about discrimination, racial discrimination, but we never talk about it at home or at the schools. My nephews, they talk about race all the time. They have 13 years old, 15 years old, and they have a narrative about racism. I didn't have this opportunity when I was young, so that's a huge transformation about to be Black in Brazil, is to be proud to be Black in Brazil. I think I remember when we have the census in 1990s, and we have a campaign and the initiative about don't let your color be blank. We have a Black movement campaign to people declare themselves Black. It was
wasn't that a play on words? I imagine it was não deixe seu cor ser em branco.
Yes.
To leave it in blank, but also in Portuguese, that means white. So there was a kind of a play of words there. But, when I teach the history of Brazil, the history of race in Brazil, I emphasize a lot the contradictions of the ideas of the sociologist Gilberto Freire, who on one hand was developing a discourse in the 30s against scientific racism, with a reading of Brazilian history as being one of the European, the African, and the indigenous, and the mixture of these three races created a nation, a people. And it silenced any criticism of structural racism that existed in Brazil because the national narrative that everyone was to be proud of was we're a blending of these three wonderful races. We all contribute different things, but they're important for what Brazilian is, a culture, whether it's samba or feijoada for Black people or things that indigenous people contribute to the country of the Europeans. And that, I think that was one of the biggest challenges of the Black United movement in the 70s and beyond, which was to kind of deconstruct that very strong national narrative that Brazilians have. It's much like the American narrative of democracy. Americans truly, profoundly, in their hearts, believe we are the best democracy in the world. And if you question that in any way, they're offended because it just strikes against everything they've learned since first grade. Does that ring true to you? How does the narrative of Gilberto Freire, that was also reinforced by Getúlio Vargas in the 30s and 40s, how did that permeate and affect society, even affect you growing up indirectly?
It's curious because it's a kind of misunderstanding, you look at the world and said, I can't see what these people are writing about Brazil, but I was a teenager, like I couldn't have tools to deal with this, but I always said there is something wrong in this interpretation because I look at the world, I look at the Brazil, and I can't see this so harmonious, so it's but it's interesting because this interpretation was so powerful. I remember when I was working my PhD dissertation, I interviewed a lot of Black professionals, and I always asked about the racial discrimination experience. And in the beginning of the interview, I always asked, have you experienced any racial discrimination in your career? No, never. 30 minutes later, they are talking about the most racist experience I've ever heard. Okay, I lost my job because they must to hire someone, to fire someone, and I was the only Black, so I lost my job. Okay, there is no racial discrimination in your life. So it's very interesting because the first reaction was, no, I have experienced this in my career. I never experienced this. But we talk about it for a lot of things, and they start, I remember that, they start to realize how this experience was a racism. So I think the first reaction is no. But when you keep working on this conversation, it's always show up some hard and terrible experience to be Black, especially for the women in the labor market.
So today we're facing in Brazil, the Bolsonaro government came to power 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago, and really deep in the polarization of the country, creating tremendous hostility towards ideas of the Black movement, ideas of quotas and affirmative action and all these kinds of things. What has been the effect in your assessment of Bolsonaro on the lives of Black people in Brazil?
So we have a curious scenario considering the Bolsonaro and racism in Brazil, because the Bolsonaro election was a backlash to our transformation about race, gender, etc. But they strengthen the anti-racism research and the anti-racism agenda is a reaction of Bolsonaro government. So the first moment you have a reaction of the inclusion narrative, and now you have a reaction to Bolsonaro's government. So that's the reason the next election is so important for us. Yeah. So the polarization produce more hate, more the rate speech in Brazil now, it's unbelievable, but also have more mobilization against racism,
Yeah, no, I when I came to Brazil in the 70s, having been involved in the civil rights movement as a young kid and coming to Brazil, being a part of the left, I was shocked at the fact that the left didn't talk about race. It just didn't make sense to me. And today, when you watch people who are talking about the current government, they're very clear. This is a government which is racist, sexist, misogynist, homophobic, anti-environment. And all of those questions are very clearly articulated as part of an understanding by everyone about the current government. The big question, of course, is if he is not reelected and another government comes to power, whether these issues will be able to be addressed in a very serious way. So let me talk about that. Historically, there was an attempt in the 30s to establish through the Black Front a political party, but it never was successful. There never was a Black political party. The vehicle of autonomous social movements was one of the ways in which people articulated their demands, their concerns, their ideas. What is your how do you see as the strategy today for the Black movement to really articulate its concerns and demands on Brazilian society?
Okay. I believe the Bolsonaro government, which claims there is no racism in Brazil, has a regressive agenda on the racial agenda. We can't say Bolsonaro doesn't have agenda about race in Brazil. He has a regressive one. For example, and the racial violence, the police brutality, and Bolsonaro tries all the time to improve the police brutality, all the time. So it's about race in Brazil.
So just to understand that, you're saying that his policies encourage violence towards the Black population, and what would be some of the, that's through his emphasis on the arms, having people having guns, and impunity of the police when they're going into communities, when people are killed indiscriminately as they're allegedly trying to go against drug lords or against criminals. Those are the things you're referring to in terms of his policies?
Exactly. The policy against indigenous people, against quilombolas, the debate about the access to land, all these questions about race. All these questions are about race. So, and that is a regressive policy to racial issues in Brazil now. And the racial inequalities, if you look at the data about racial inequalities in Brazil, and you pick the first decade in this century, we have a huge decrease of the racial inequality. The racial inequality started to increase again in 2014, and and during the COVID and after COVID-19, there's no after COVID yet, but the racial inequality became huge again, the difference between Black and white in Brazil. So the effect of the public policies and on the racial inequality in Brazil is huge. Black population in Brazil needs public policy, and this policy must discuss race.
So Bolsonaro, in a last-minute attempt to win the election, has increased the stipend that families are getting, $20 or $30 a month more. It's not a large amount of money, but it is a significant amount of money for poor people. And the majority of people in Brazil are very poor or extremely poor. Do you think that's going to have an effect on the elections at this point? Could that turn the elections in his favor?
Maybe a little effect, but I think he can't change his situation with this, because 70% of the people who needs to social benefits like this new one, during the pandemic we call emergency assistance, but now there is a new name, the Brazil. Yeah.
Brazilian help or assistance, yeah.
70% of this population is Black. The poverty is Black in Brazil. Everybody knows about that. But at the same time, some research about elections the Black people and the women don't support Bolsonaro. So
they might be happy to get the money, but they see through it as an electoral maneuver in order to kind of get votes at the last minute.
Maybe in São Paulo state, maybe definitely in Rio de Janeiro state because of the militia and everything else. The impact of this money will be bigger than on other states. For example, I think they can't impact the Northeastern Brazil, for example. They don't vote for Bolsonaro. That's very impressive. The resistance to the Northeast people to vote for Bolsonaro is since the first election. Yeah.
Márcia, you've taught about race in the United States and in Brazil. I'd be curious to hear your experience about doing that in two different countries.
Yeah, actually, I always have contact with I have a lot of experience with American students, but I never teach.
Okay.
But I want to teach. That's one thing I want to do soon is teach in the American universities. And I have the privilege to visit the most important university in the state, like Columbia, Harvard, Brown, invited by you. And I think I can talk a little bit about it, considering my content, because I always talk a lot with students in the United States. And actually, it's very curious because the American students, when they visit Brazil, they couldn't see Black students and Black professors. So I'm a kind of, oh, wow, there is a Black professor in Brazil. But I think the reality is very different because, the quality of the university, the structure of the university in the United States is very different. But I think I can describe how the Black students in Brazil University has totally changed recently. And so now I can see in Brazil something I've already seen in the United States. So I've been in the United States since 1960. My first visit to American University in the 90s, 1997. So in 1997, there is no Black students in Brazil in university. So for me, it was a shock. I said, wow, they are Black students in the university here, and the good ones. So it's it's different when you compare the Brazilian experience now and in the past and look at the United States. Do you know what I mean? I think it's different for us. Look at the Brazilian University and American University today and 30 years ago. And when I received Black American students here in Brazil, they were shocked about the low number of I think they have expectation. I'm going to Brazil, I'm a Black student, I'm going to Brazil, to the university, I'm going to talk to Black people. And they don't talk, and they didn't talk about with Black people, because there is no Black people in the past. So I think that's, for me, is my first impression about the experience, university experience in the United States and Brazil. But also, if you consider now, the public policies to access higher education in Brazil, now is bigger than the United States.
Right.
Yeah.
In fact, in the United States, it's possible that the Supreme Court will reverse many of the programs in the next year, the next sessions of the Supreme Court in the United States. So Brazil is going to be the model for inclusion in the future, it seems to me, if things go the right way.
But I think in the United States, you have more the debate about race in the classrooms, for example, in the teaching courses, and it's much more consolidated than here. So, for example, when I was in Harvard with Professor Gates, I attended his class about Introduction to African American Studies, for example. We don't have nothing like that in Brazil until today. But these new students, they asking for, we want to read Black authors, we want to discuss about racial inequality. We can't talk more about in Brazilian social thought without talk about Black scholars. And I think the next 10 years, maybe it will be the most transformation in Brazilian university about race. It's not only the presence of the Black students, but also the presence of the Black professors. We are very, very, very small group in Brazil. And they want to talk about race and about gender. And the Brazilian universities definitely will be changed more in the next 10 years, considering how we offer courses and debate about race inside the university. I think because it's very important, because in my opinion, there is a problem here. I think it's not a Brazilian problem. I think it's about this question is about generation. The young students now, they want to talk about themselves, about their experience, about how they live in your community, in your neighborhood. And they have a kind of resistance to, for example, to read the Gilberto Freire, Nina Rodrigues, or other authors. They don't agree, for example. And I insisted with my students, you must read these guys. You can, I want to just read about racial inequality, racial matters, but I want to agree with other authors, or there's no way you become an intellectual or a social science, for example, if you don't read someone you don't agree. I think but I think it's more, maybe in the United States the same. They have a reaction about the kind of interpretation about Brazil, and maybe the same in the United States.
You also run the risk of students saying, I'm offended by what is written, therefore I refuse to read it because it upsets me, and therefore I won't read it. It always strikes me as strange, because if you have a criticism of a way of thinking, the best way to criticize it is to understand it, to take it apart, and then you can articulate the problems you have with it, as opposed to, well, I didn't read it, but I've heard this is what they've said. So it's the challenge of all teachers everywhere. But I think social media has played a very powerful role in these changes that have gone on. I'm thinking about the ways in which the social media has facilitated the arrival of new ideas and news about what's happening in other countries. And it's in a way, I think, influenced the way race has been constructed in Brazil. What do you see as the role of the United States in that process?
I think social media has revolutionized, for the better and for the worse, the political dynamics in Brazil, especially about race. But I think it's not only in Brazil, it's everywhere. Now we have more access to information, and we can expand our tools to political transformation, to political mobilization. But we still have the fake news, and it's highly dangerous for democracy. The impact of the United States, I think you can talk about George Floyd. When you talk about media, about United States, about change in Brazil, we need to talk about the George Floyd's death reaction. So while the reaction to George Floyd's death against the racism is in every place in the world, but I think for the Brazilian experience was very important, the reaction to the George Floyd death. When you have our own George Floyd, for example, the Beto Freitas murder in Carrefour in Porto Alegre, I believe that the international repercussion about this death is about social media and is about George Floyd. You have a before and after George Floyd in the world, and this before and after about this before and after George Floyd's murder is about social media, is about how you can reach people now and you can mobilize people now to participate in protests, and you can create international agenda against racism or other questions like gender and homophobia, So we have an international articulation about to fight racism. It's very important.
I think you know Professor Michael Hanchard of the Department of African Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. He recently published research saying that Blacks in Brazil have much more radical potential than in the United States. Any thoughts about his comments?
Yeah. Michael Hanchard is a great friend of mine. And I think this interpretation depends on how we define radical potential and for what. I read the news about the interview when he said that, and I couldn't identify specifically what's this kind of potential he's talking about. But I think Brazil is a Black country, and the first radical potential we have this potential because we are a Black country, and we can't deny the importance of the Brazilian transformation to Latin America, for example. There is, I think, the second radical potential we can think about. If you look at how the public policy in Brazil impact all the region, especially Colombia and other countries in the region, to create racial equality programs, it's huge. So there is no debate about Afro-Latin American studies without Brazil. And so we have this potential to make our policies important to the Latin America. Yeah. And so we have a very political empowered Black youth doing these changes we were talking about all the time. And I think that's the potential maybe Mike is talking about. This Black youth in Brazil now is very potential, and Brazil can lead the Latin America to face this all this political system and the racism, systemic racism in the region. The recent elections in Latin America are very, very important. In Brazil now, you can turn to the left again. Chile and the other countries, the election in the other countries now, it's very important what's happening in Latin America. And if we take Bolsonaro off, I think you have a new configuration a new political configuration in the Latin American region, considering especially the debate about race.
Great. I couldn't agree with you more. And I really do think that the changes in university policies have created a new generation of young people who are going to have an effect over the years as they go on to get masters and PhDs and start getting teaching positions. I think it's going to have a real influence on the country as a whole. I agree with you. It's creating a generation of Black scholars, of Black intellectuals that is going to be very important. Is there anything else you'd like to share with us today before we finish the program?
I think we have, I'd like to stress out some questions. The first one is about the elections, Brazilian elections this year. We are living, I think, the most important moment for the Brazilian democracy. And I'm very concerned about it. And I think this election will define what kind of country we'll have for the future. And also, in 4 years, we have seen how a government managed to destroy democratic values. And the next 4 years must to take another direction. So I think that this point is very, very important. And the participation of the Black movement and in the left parties in this process is crucial. We have some movement in Brazil, some initiative from Black movement The first one was, what the name of that? I forgot the name. We have the initiative, as long as there is racism, there will be no democracy. This campaign during the COVID pandemic, it was very, very important to debate, to create a more qualified debate about race in Brazil. And the connection between racism and democracy was a very strong connection, a very powerful campaign to face both racism and no democracy movements. And now there is a new movement from the Black Coalition for Rights, a Coalizão Negra por Direitos, and the Quilombo in the parliaments. I think this movement, they support more than 100 candidates from the Black movement during this next election. So it's much more important, in my opinion, to create this debate about race in different parties, especially the left ones, because the right parties, they have more Black candidates than in the last election. Right parties had more Black candidates than the left ones. So we need to change this. I think this election also is important to consolidate the racial issue in the left parties in Brazil. They can't move more without consolidate the racial agenda in the parties in Brazil. I think that's very, very important. So this election is about democracy. This election is more than other elections. This election is about race and racism in Brazil, more than other elections. And it's a huge challenge for us to understand this process. So as a social scientist, we're trying to understand some process, and in Brazil, some process is hard to understand. But I think that's my final remarks about the racial political questions in Brazil. We need to take Bolsonaro down and start almost from scratch to reconstruct this country.
Márcia, I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us on Brazil Unfiltered today. I know you've been struggling against a really bad cold, and it's been really difficult over the last couple of weeks to get through it. Fortunately, it seems to be it's gone, and so you're in a better place than you were.
Thank you, Jim.
So to my listeners, I hope you all enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.